Good morning, everybody. Dave Schmidt along with Matt Nestor and producer Tom Warner. We want to get right into this segment. I have a special guest with us today from the IHSA, Assistant Executive Director Craig Anderson, and he's working with a committee now to look at the seeding process for the future in boys basketball and girls basketball and some other sports. First of all, Craig, thanks for getting up on Valentine's Day, and happy Valentine's Day to you and yours.
Yeah, thank you. Same to you guys. Thanks for having me.
You know, we've been complaining and moaning and groaning in our part of the country because we go to regionals, and sometimes, like our girls' regionals this year, we got like 3 really quality teams, and only one of them is going to come out of that. And now you guys are looking into it. Can you give us a little background on how this all started, on your point from the IHSA about looking at how the seeding process might change in the future for some, basketball and the other sports?
Yeah, sure can. Yeah, you know, our process, and what you're talking about there is our seeding in bracketed team sports, and currently it's in board policy, and so our board has the ability to change whenever they see fit anything that's in board policy. So, you know, for a number of years and in a number of sports, we hear similar concerns that you guys are facing up there with some of your girls and boys regionals. That, you know, some of the regionals just get packed full of really solid teams, and it's unfortunate that only one of those get to make it to the sectional. So, you know, we heard the membership. Our board heard the cry, kind of the cry of the membership in that regard. So last June, they told our staff, and so 4 of us are together working with a group of athletic directors to form an ad hoc committee and talk about some possible changes to this board policy. So we're in the midst of that. We've come with some general idea. We've had a couple meetings. We're going to have one more, and then we'll send it to our board of directors, and it'll be up to them to decide if it's something they want to adopt and change or if they want to leave it as it is.
You know, what are the 2 biggest factors when you look at that? I'd have to imagine maybe it's travel cost and then obviously the competitiveness. You know, what kind of gets weighed more when you're looking at something like that?
Well, I think the situation we're in now with predetermined regionals and all of 1A and 2A, and then in 3A and 4A outside of the Chicago suburban area, was a result of the geography. You know, we're a principals organization, and the superintendents kind of have the ear of those principals. So I think when this was adopted, it was when gas prices were accelerating really high. And not that schools aren't in a financial situation, because we know many of them are, but I think with the decline of and getting used to the gas prices, that might be a point that has not as significant as it was back when this was adopted maybe, 8 to 10 years ago.
You know, we look at this, the way they do it, like some of the Chicago ones and other ones in other areas where all the teams are put into one place and all seated together. And like in ours, it's like 4 or 5 different regionals. How do you think it's going to work if you do this? Will you everybody be the same, or will it continue to be everybody seated in those Chicago regionals the way they have been, or will they also adjust to this new plan you're looking at?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. You know, I'm not. I can share with you kind of where we've landed as a committee, and it's somewhere that we were in the early 2000s, and that is in 1A and 2A, instead of having predetermined 4 regionals, and this would include 3A and 4A outside the Chicago suburban area, to look at having what we call sub-sectionals. So it'd be a combination of 2 of the existing regionals coming together, seeding those 2 regionals together to still try and minimize the geography of one big sectional, but dividing it in half would at least spread out the top 2, the top 2 teams in that, what we would now call a sub-sectional, and then we would seed accordingly. We divide accordingly into those 2 regionals how that sub-sectional was seeded. Presently, the committee believes, and this I believe, and we're going to reinforce it at the next meeting before we take it to the board, they believe that the current situation with an entire sectional is fine because the geography isn't that much in the Chicago suburban area where they're really tightly packed in 3A, 4A. But they think this will clear up the concerns because now those top 2 teams that might be on a half in that subsectional, when they potentially win their regional, they'd come to the sectional and we'd cross bracket that. And, then those 2 that were seated together could end up in the sectional championship.
You talk about some of the geography and the travel. One thing I've always kind of noticed is, with Chicago, they often do the one sectional together, but, a lot of that travel would be similar to what we see in this area, because sometimes getting around Chicago can be pretty hard. Is some of that maybe helping ease some of those concerns too, saying, well, they're really traveling 30, 45 minutes when it's all said and done, so these other teams could probably do that too?
Yeah, I think it is. Yeah, and our committee is, of course, all statewide, and we hear some of that as we talk about some travel and distances that, on a pick your evening when they're trying to get to a baseball or softball game or girls basketball, boys basketball during the week, while the distance isn't very much, the time is significant, and so they're having to leave at, significant times to get there. So, yeah, I think it becomes a wash in terms of, into rural areas. When you get in the bus and you head off, you don't have traffic, you're just going. Whereas there are some time restrictions depending upon where you're at in the city, trying to get out a little bit, or in the suburbs, they're just some real time restrictions.
One thing we've always seen here in our area, and a lot of times, and I know even in the suburbs, they've seen it at different times, where a regional ends up being entirely more competitive than the sectional does. As part of this, maybe trying to get some of the better competition deeper when more eyes are kind of watching things?
Oh, absolutely. That's kind of the cry we hear from the coaches, and it's very understandable that they'd want to see that key game, that key matchup happen a little later in the tournament versus early in the tournament, like a regional semifinal or a regional final. And so, yeah, the excitement and the buildup of having those key matchups later in the tournament, was going to create some more excitement regionally within those areas. So, yeah, that's really kind of the push, I believe, is making those key matchups happen a little later.
We're talking with the IHSA's Craig Anderson, one of the assistant executive directors of the IHSA, and they're looking at the seeding process. When will this all take place if it happens? Will you guys decide? There won't be a IHSA vote on it. You guys would decide. Would it go into effect maybe next year already?
Yeah, that's our timeline. We anticipate later this spring taking it to our board of directors, and this is something that's, as I mentioned when we started, that is board policy. So things that are board policy don't always go to the membership for a vote. And there's reasons for that, because there's things that we have that, sometimes we need to change in a quicker fashion, where our bylaws take a full year, kind of a cycle, to go through the amendment proposal process. Those things take time. So, yeah, we anticipate, if this is something that our committee asks us to move on to the board, and our board recommends, that we likely have implementation for next school year.
I did a little homework on this during the process, and I noticed that you guys are not the only state that faces this issue. A state that I'm pretty familiar with, Ohio, does the same process. They get the same complaints. Did you talk to other people in other associations and ask for ideas on how maybe to solve this, or did you guys just go ahead and look at the needs of Illinois?
Well, yeah, it's twofold. A number of times throughout the year, we'll have associations across the country get together. We have a summer meeting, and then I have another meeting that I meet with in the fall with a number of Midwest states, and, everything's up for discussion at those times. And so, yeah, we want to take care of what's at home. So we listen to our administrators. We listen to ADs in particular, who are right in the heat of it. But we also listen to our principals and superintendents. So we want to take care of us locally, but obviously we'll look at some ideas if somebody's got a good one in Ohio or Indiana or Wisconsin, whatever the case might be. There's a lot of sharing there.
When you look at this, how do you see it? You're ahead of the committee. You guys are all working on this. Do you see it going in a certain direction, or you still feel that there's still too much to decide before you make that choice to say, yeah, I think this is what we're going to do?
Yeah, I would say that based upon our two meetings, that there's a general consensus that there's a liking to this sub-sectional idea, that while it doesn't maximize travel, spreading the sectional out, seating the entire sectional, it maintains a little bit of geography, but it also allows for splitting up some top teams in some regional areas, some right next door neighbors that get caught in that regional together, help spread them out. So I think that's the direction we're likely headed, pending this next meeting and then moving forward with the board.
When something is board policy like this, how does it come up? Is it just, since you don't have the members involved in the voting, does it still come from those complaints, or is this things that you guys look at, just kind of on a continual basis?
Well, there's things that we'll review annually, biannually, but generally, if we hear a consensus, and our boys basketball, in particular the IBCA, the Boys Coaches Association, has for a number of years brought this point up. And, when we start to hear from multiple groups, and that notion gets to our board and we continue to hear it, then, we mention to our board, hey, we're continuing to hear this year after year. Let's take some time, let's review it, let's get some heads together and see if we can come up with an idea. And we got, our state is so varied by rural and suburban, and so there's just a lot of facets to how our classes are divided. And our biggest class 4A, we'll have a downstate sectional that just covers huge geography. So to think that we could do that in the sectional is very difficult. So we've got to get heads together and have some representation from all those different, from small schools to big schools, urban schools, and so it comes from an idea, usually from our membership athletic directors, that kind of will let us know the pulse and maybe something to think about changing.
Obviously when you make a decision, not everybody's going to be happy. I think there's probably more people that agree with us than not, but there's probably some old school people that say, well, you got to play everybody at some point. Who cares if you play them early or late? How do you kind of sell this to maybe some of those people that don't want to see the change?
Well, yeah, that's the interesting piece to this, is there's always somebody on the other side, and we try to meet in the middle and do what generally our majority would want. I wasn't there in the office at the time, but I mentioned, like, in the early 2000s, we had this sub-sectional idea, and those that are in the office would say that those were 2 or 3 of the most relaxed years in regards to coaches, and so that feedback and those with that kind of history let us know that this maybe is a good direction to head to, as the concern of geography is kind of have gone away. We have a coach's mindset, we have a principal's mindset, then we have a superintendent's mindset, and all those can be a little bit different, and this is one example. If we expand that geography too much, then those that are paying for the bus mileage and the gas, and typically the superintendents that are watching the budget, the coach isn't concerned about that. He wants to play, be able to get to the sectional if he should or she should, and so that's the other part of this. It's a difficult sell, depending upon the group you're talking to.
So basically, I'm going to have to call it sub-sectional instead of regional if this passes, so I have to remember all that stuff, right, Craig?
Yeah, once what we'll do is we'll seed what we'll call a subsection, which is just 2 regionals put together. We'll seed all of them collectively, but then they'll be divided up into regional play. So it'll just have to do with the seeding, the initial part of how we get going, and then once we have seeded that, what we'll call a subsectional, then they will go into regional play. So that language won't be too much different.
Well, Craig, thanks so much for taking time out today. We get tired of bothering Matt Troha all the time, so maybe you're the new guy on our list we can bother once in a while.
Well, Matt's a good guy. He's got the pulse of everything. I mean, talk about an exceptional guy that does great work for us. But, yeah, I'm always happy to jump on and share some things with you guys. It's good to get out and help and, inform the public of what might be coming next in the IHSA.
Well, thanks so much, Craig, and you have a good day. Happy Valentine's Day to you, too.
Thanks. You too, guys.
We've been talking to IHSA's Craig Anderson, the Assistant Executive Director, talking about seeding process. At least we're moving in a good direction, I think, Matt.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree with that, and it's nice because, in theory, I don't think the regional is a bad idea, but, you would like to see some of that separated, and I think that's what we're kind of looking at is maybe spreading some of these teams out where, maybe as we look at the girls one, you could have, Hononegah, Boylan, and Auburn kind of spread out a little bit where they're not playing each other right off the bat. Eventually they're still going to have to get there.
Be the third time they'll play each other.
Right, and eventually that'd still have to happen. But you can do it a little bit further down the road.
Yeah.
You'd like to see, 2 of those teams in a sectional if you could, or maybe, because I know you kind of talked about maybe reseeding once they're in a sectional, and have them battle for a sectional championship, something like that. And I think that's what you want to see at the end of the day.
Yeah, and like I said, there's other states suffering through this too, so I guess it's just part of the ball game.
Yeah, and and it happens in other parts of the state too. It's not that it's just our area, but I know there's, we talked about the girls one. I know there's been years in the boys where, probably Auburn boys